It's now my pleasure to bring to the stage the founder and chief executive officer of New Mountain Capital, LLC, Stephen B. Klinsky.
Clock started. Thanks, everybody. I have two great honors today. I've been given the next 5 or 10 minutes to do two things. First of all, to give you a couple of my own thoughts about where business fits with society, but then even more importantly, to introduce the lunch speaker and our guest of honor, Carly Fiorina. So I'm very pleased to do both of those things. And I have to say, I was here for the first part of the morning to hear the business plans and to see some of the presentations, and it's just a great society, and to be at this stage in 2 or 3 years of your life is, I think, a great accomplishment, and looks like a wonderful organization to be part of. New Mountain, just very briefly, is a growth-oriented private equity firm. We manage about $12 billion of capital. We own 20 or so businesses in a range of industries in software and medical devices and information. We're low on use of debt and really focus on the growth. So that's what we do for a living. But what I'd like to do is just kind of talk about some of the big issues that the Adam Smith Society deals with. And it is a very, very interesting time, to be in business, because I took my 4th grade daughter to see the Lego movie that some of you may have seen. And of course, the arch villain is President Business, who was formerly known as Lord Business. And then you go out of the movie and you say, gee, that movie was made by a business to promote a product for another business. So it's kind of an odd time, or this is more sensitive to my industry, and it's a little bit older movie, but if you see the movie Manchurian Candidate, if you get it on Netflix and get the remake, in the original version in 1960, there was a presidential assassin who was brainwashed by communist North Korea to assassinate the president, and in the remake, he was brainwashed by a private equity firm in Washington, D.C. To assassinate the president. So I get a little thin-skinned sometime, and therefore, when the Manhattan Institute, which I just greatly admire, said, would you like to introduce Carly Fiorina? I said, I think she's wonderful, and I think the cause is pretty important, so I'm very pleased to be included. And so let me just give you a couple of observations and then introduce our guest speaker. But the first observation I would make is to really think about all the premises about business, both on the left and on the right, with kind of fresh eyes, because there's so much debate that is just repeated and repeated without people really thinking. So, I mean, the fundamental kind of premise about capitalism, the word capitalism, is that one group of people owns the capital, like the way a feudal land baron would own the land, and then there's another class of people that must work because you own the capital. And that's kind of the underlying assumption. And in fact, when you examine it, that's really not how the world works anymore. I mean, when I say I am the founder and the CEO of a $12 billion private equity firm, I unfortunately do not own that $12 billion myself. It comes from university endowments and pension plans and workers' retirement plans. So the workers own the capital. They are the capitalists, and I am working for them. And similarly, when you think about Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Bank, he does not own J.P. Morgan Bank. It's owned by a very, very broad base of institutions and pension funds. So you don't have this feudal idea that you own the capital and you can drive people to do what you want. In fact, it's all based on trust. You either have the trust of people who do have the capital, who are trusted by someone else generally, or you don't have trust. So it's not a power relationship, it's a trust relationship, which is kind of very different than people normally think about it from the left. And then, on the more conservative side, I think there's also lots of kind of weak thinking, where you hear people say, they do something that hurts a lot of people. Well, it's creative destruction. Creative destruction is good. Creative destruction is a little bit like when you get a shot, it hurts. I mean, the pain of the shot is not good. It's kind of a necessary evil. It's not like something to be proud about. You want to minimize it. Creative creation is good. Creative destruction is something to be minimized as much as possible. So sometimes people on the pro-business side also defend themselves in kind of ways without deeply thinking about it. And what I would encourage, the way I'd encourage you all to think about business is avoid kind of the left or the right or all the old arguments and go back to the most fundamental principles of respect for the individual and the respect for human creativity. And if you start with those two fundamental principles, I think you'll come out as a strong advocate of business. Because if you say there's government, business, and charities, let's just say those are the three basic structures, the most fundamental voluntary structure between two people dealing with each other equally is business. When you have the government, the government makes laws, they have police departments, they have military, and ultimately, a law is not voluntary. If it's voluntary, it's not a law. The whole idea is that ultimately, if you don't follow the law, there's some power that can force you to follow the law, even in a representative government. And in a charity, there's kind of a superior body who's the giver, and kind of a secondary body who's the taker, who really shouldn't complain and should take what they get, and they're really not face-to-face equal. What's so fundamentally ethical about business when you do it right is there are two people or more dealing. They're all coming together voluntarily. They all have the choice, should they be together, in what form to be together. So there's a fundamental ethical underpinnings to business, which is really important. So if you want a chair and I make a chair, you can agree that you like my chair or not. And so we're dealing with each other as equals. It's not, you must take what I give you or I will arrest you. I mean, it's a different model. Second, business properly understood is a highly form of a creative act. I mean, this thought that here's the school of the humanities where people are creative and care about creation, and then here's the business school where people don't create things, they're just kind of greedy, I think is really an important idea to prevent and not get caught up in. And also, as you set your own life, to try to live by these principles, because we all know it's a creative act to paint a picture of a farm. I think it's equally creative to actually create the farm. I mean, to take the wood and the steel and the animals and all the people who have to be and to unite them into a working farm. Or we would all know it's creative, a work of art. If you made a papier-mâché airplane that's an incredibly good job and you put it in an art gallery, that is a piece of creative art. But let's say you actually create an airplane that holds hundreds of people and actually flies and goes from New York to Tokyo nonstop and does it at a very affordable cost, and then you create a series of factories with thousands of people to make thousands of these planes, and every one of them is more valuable than the goods you're using to make the plane. That is also a form of creative human endeavor, and because there's all these other constraints you're trying to meet in the complexity, it's actually a very high form of creativity. And I think if people think about respect for individuals and creativity, you will get to a much better understanding of what makes a good business or a bad business, or why business has a role in society. The next observation I would make to you is that it's important, I think, to track yourself and businesses by the standards I just gave, and that it's not just how much money did you make. That you don't want to misunderstand Adam Smith to say, well, if I made a profit, it proves I was good, because no matter how miserable I am, the invisible hand will work it out. There are ways to make money that are not good, and there are ways to make money that I think are exceptionally good, but it goes down to those two principles that I gave you about the respect for others and the creativity. And you can do a social dashboard for yourself and your organization in ways that people don't normally think. So I'm in private equity, which is considered like Danny DeVito going in to mortgage the desk with a big cigar and fire everybody and strip the desk. So, and I really don't want to be perceived that way because I have 4 kids and all that. And so for my own firm, after the great crash, or not the great crash, but the Great Recession began in 2008, we started doing a social dashboard for New Mountain, which we put on our website every year. No one asked us to do it, and we just update it every year, following some of the key metrics that we think matter. And if you read it, we have a year old, and we're about to put the new one on, or we just put it on this week. Our organization, which is not the biggest in the world, has added or created over 17,000 jobs net of any job losses, pay way more than the national average of these jobs, has spent $2.2 billion in R&D and software development and CapEx, has never had a bankruptcy, has never missed an interest payment. So, I mean, that's just our own social dashboard. But let's say you're at Walmart. If your social dashboard was, we've saved hundreds of millions of Americans, 5% on their purchases, just think of the billions of dollars they've saved for people. Or if you're Monsanto and you get 4 corn crops a year instead of 3, think of the starvation you've eliminated. So if you can, find ways to think about what you do and how you do it and explain it to yourself and others, it's important. And, I always used to, people say, well, why'd you do it? I say, well, I got 4 kids. And literally, I was driving home a week ago, and my 6th grader in the back seat says, hey, Dad, this is a true story, literally a week ago. He says, hey, Dad, I learned what private equity does at school. You buy these companies and fire everybody. And I said, hey, Owen. And I take the iPad, go to the website, go read it out loud to the car. So, it is an important thing, and if your own, I'm a private equity, my own kid needs a prompter, God forbid what a lot of other people need. So, and then the last point I would make, and again, Carly Fiorina is one of the great examples of this, the same skills that work at business, also the creative skills, the organization skills, work in government, work in charity, work in all sorts of things, and so you have a base to do other things, not because you're guilty that you were in business, not because business doesn't allow you to do good things in the world, but just because there's lots of ways to do good things for the world, and the same person can be involved in many things. I've been involved with charter schools and a lot of other things myself. But so anyways, that's kind of my preachy part of the presentation. But what I'd like to do now, though, is I'm very privileged to do this, is introduce our featured speaker, Carly Fiorina. She's a great example of kind of all the concepts I've just tried to give you. She paid her way through school. She started her job as a secretary for a small business. She rose to be the CEO of one of the 20 most important companies in America, one of the Fortune 20 companies at Hewlett-Packard. She was absolutely a transformational leader of that business with the Compact acquisition and other acquisitions. And then when she, after having just a fantastic business career, went into public service. I don't know Carly extremely well, but I had a chance to meet her years ago when she was running for Senate. I was at a dinner, supporting her at a dinner here in New York, and I remember hearing her talk at the table, having a chance to talk to her, and I do have to warn Brad, who did the water project, she was talking about California water at the dinner, and I said, wow, this is a smart person, and I just was sitting next to her at lunch a little bit, and I still say, boy, this is a smart person who really has some great ideas. So she's done wonderful in that sense. She's been involved at a senior level in presidential campaigns, now runs another major philanthropy. So I hope you will give some applause and welcome our featured speaker, Carly Fiorina.
Thank you and good afternoon. This is a great program. I wish we'd had this when I was in business school. And I'm so sorry that I have to leave immediately following my speech because I've had such a fantastic time this morning. Every speaker, and of course our pitch competitors as well, were so great. But I was taking copious notes through Marilyn and Jim and John's talks. I think the opportunity for you as students with big futures ahead of you to come here for a weekend and pause and reflect and learn from others about how our nation works and the role of business is incredibly valuable. And I'm quite certain that you will remember these experiences for many, many years to come. I was talking with your videographer over lunch, and I was asked a question that caused me to bring up a kind of old analogy, but I want to bring it up to you. And the analogy is, all of you have heard the story about the frog. You know, you throw a frog in a pot of boiling water, and the frog will jump out. If you put a frog in a pot of water and slowly bring that pot of water to a boil, the frog will die. Why is that? Well, because The frog senses that the water's boiling when you throw him in cold, but when you're just sitting there, it's kind of comfortable for a while. It's kind of comfortable for a long while until all of a sudden you're so comfortable you don't have the strength to make the change jump out that's necessary. And without being unduly alarmist, I think that's quite an accurate analogy for where we are right now in this country, and why the conversation that we've been having this morning and that you'll continue to have is so important. So to illustrate that, let me go back to the beginning. There was that fantastic chart that Dr. Madison showed where, you know, millennia of human existence, and then all of a sudden there's this huge spike. Why did that happen? Why is this nation the foundation of entrepreneurialism? It happened because our country was founded on a radical idea. A radical idea. It is radical to this day. And that radical idea was that everyone and anyone has human potential. That everyone and anyone has the right to try and fulfill that potential. Our founding fathers phrased it as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as we know from authors from Aristotle to Adam Smith, happiness was a word to describe fulfill your potential. By the way, I'll start with a confession. I was a philosophy and history major as an undergraduate. That's why the only job I could get was as a secretary. But what it means is I go back to history and philosophy a lot. So here's this radical political idea. It is still radical. There is not another nation on earth that is founded with that fundamental principle. And over time, of course, we said in this country, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter what your last name is. It doesn't matter. You have the right to fulfill your potential. That political idea, coupled with the idea that enlightened self-interest and the entrepreneurial spirit, that built a nation. I do not believe that spike in prosperity would have happened if the only thing that had happened was Adam Smith wrote a book. I do not believe the entrepreneurial spirit would have caught in any other nation but the United States. But that document that said, no, we are going to build our society on the political idea that every human being has the potential and the right to fulfill it, and then we are going to couple that with the creation of an opportunity where anyone can say, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to try something new. And by the way, if I fail, I'm going to pick myself up and try again. In many ways, pioneers took incredible risks to get across this nation because what they were leaving behind wasn't good enough. People came across oceans. People crossed borders under incredible duress. Why? Because what they were leaving behind wasn't good enough. This was a nation that believed that everyone has an opportunity, the right to build a better life for themselves and their families and to dream big and to do it however they wanted to do it. That basically is what entrepreneurialism is. It is still a radical idea. I have traveled everywhere in the world. I have worked everywhere in the world. I will guarantee you there is still no other country on the face of the earth where a woman could start out as a secretary and become the chief executive of the largest technology company in the world. It is only possible here. So we have this incredible system, this incredible nation built on brilliant political ideas and brought to life with an understanding of how an economy could work, could lift people out of poverty based on innovation, risk-taking, and entrepreneurialism, and founded in the very moral belief that everyone has potential and that we are all equal in that regard. Now let's fast forward. Now I'm turning up the heat on that little frog in the pot of water, because what's happened over the last 40 years? What's happened is we have had 40 years of complexity, regulation, laws, 40 years of it. Back in Washington's day, you will remember George Washington was celebrated for the fact that he said, "I will be president, not king," although he was offered the opportunity to be a king. And at the end of 2 terms, he said, "I will leave public life and return to public service, and I will return to private life." We used to have a nation where we believed in citizen government. That is, people came from private life, went into public service, and then retired back again to private life because we thought that. Washington thought that. You know, there are things that I know from private life that I can apply to public service, but if I stay in public service too long, I will lose connection with real life. I will become corrupted by the process. We are now in a place in the last 40 years where we have professional politicians. I'm not saying they're bad people. I think many of them are very smart and well-meaning people, but nevertheless, the vast majority of people who are working in government either as elected officials or as bureaucrats have been there their entire adult lives. And they believe their job is to do stuff. I'm supposed to do stuff. I'm supposed to write regulations. I'm supposed to make laws. I'm supposed to do stuff. And for the last 40 years, that's been going on. Consider this. Under Republicans and Democrats alike, the budget of virtually every federal agency has increased every year for 40 years. That's a fact. Imagine you were running a business where you had a business that got more money every year for 40 years, no matter what. No matter what. And imagine that that business that got more money every year, no matter what, that you basically didn't have a lot of metrics for judging their progress or their success. What kind of business would you have? You would have a big, bloated bureaucracy that was inefficient, ineffective, and yes, corrupt in many, many ways. The truth is, we have no idea how our money is being spent in Washington, D.C. But what we know is that it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and has for 40 years, and that there are people in that system who have been doing stuff for 40 years. And that stuff has created unbelievable complexity. What else has gone on recently? Well, by the way, what happens in all that complexity? Free market capitalism, as Marilyn so brilliantly told us this morning, and as well Carl Schramm last night, free market capitalism becomes crony capitalism because companies learn to take advantage of it. And businesses, particularly big businesses, hire loads of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists, and those people come to Washington to make the system work for them, for their competitive advantage. Entrepreneurs made this country great. Entrepreneurs lift people out of poverty. Another way to say that is small business matters. Most people in America got their first chance the way I got my first chance. I worked as a secretary in a little 9-person firm. Small businesses are the backbones of our communities. Yes, some entrepreneurs become hugely successful businesses, but every big business you can name started as a small business. Small businesses create more than half the jobs. They employ more than half the people in this country. They innovate at a rate 7 times that of large businesses. When I left Hewlett-Packard, I was really proud of the fact that we were generating 11 patents a day. Small and new businesses generate innovations and patents at 7 times the rate of big businesses. In other words, small businesses count. And so what we have right now is a situation in which more small businesses are failing and fewer are starting than at any time in the last 40 years. That's what the data tells us. More are failing, fewer are starting than at any time in the last 40 years. This growth of complexity in government, these big businesses taking advantage of all of that, that's the water turning up on the poor little frog, and small business formation at a 40-year low, that's a consequence. 70% of small business owners and entrepreneurs describe government as hostile. 70% in a recent Washington Post poll. Not neutral, not frustrating, hostile. And if you ask small business owners, well, why'd you quit or why aren't you starting? The answer you get a lot of times is, it's just too hard. I can't make my way through all the regulation. I can't understand a 26,000-page tax code. Hewlett-Packard can. Well, we can hire people. A small business can't. And of course, on top of everything else, we have a situation where, given the Wall Street meltdown, people understandably look to business and say, are these moral actors? Are business people really the good guys? And unfortunately, there are too many examples of where business people may not have been the good guys. Let us face it, there are many reasons for the Wall Street collapse. And some of those start with government agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and regulators not doing their jobs. But it is also fair to say that there was a fair amount of greed and short-sightedness and a suspension of common sense and good judgment when people all over this town said, you know what, prices are just going to keep going up. They're just going to keep going up. Everybody knew that couldn't be true, and yet, as Chuck Prince famously said, we all have to keep dancing until the music stops. And sometimes people look at businesses or at boards and say, you know what, they're not being held accountable. I wrote a somewhat controversial op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in which I said that the board of any company that takes public money should resign en masse. Because whatever else you can say, if a board has failed in its most fundamental fiduciary duty to protect the franchise and have to take taxpayer money to bail them out, they have failed and should be fired just as surely as any worker should be. So when people see that business is not always held accountable, when people see the incredible negative consequences of poor business judgment or greed, then they start to question whether business is good or not. And of course, that was the inspiration for the Adam Smith Society. Then you have things like Dodd-Frank, more complexity. And whatever you think of Dodd-Frank, it is true now that instead of having 10 banks that are too big to fail, we have 5. That community banking is under intense pressure. That's a problem because community banks are where most small businesses go to get their shot. As Carl Schramm most appropriately reminded us last night of all the hoopla about venture capital, only 2% of the entrepreneurs and small businesses in this country have ever seen a venture capitalist. It's the community banks where they get their lift. So when the community banks are under pressure, that's a problem. And now we have Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act. Again, whatever you think of that, although I can guess what many of you think of it, whatever you think of it, here's what is true about it. The Affordable Care Act is longer than a Harry Potter novel. Literally. It is longer than a Harry Potter novel. And it has been accompanied by 2,000 additional pages of regulations that codify it, modify it, amend it. Do we really honestly believe that a Harry Potter novel plus 2,000 pages can manage effectively anything? What we have done is layer unbelievable new complexity onto an already complex and broken system. And those thousands and thousands and thousands of pages have been unduly influenced by companies that have agendas to protect. That is the fact. This is the furthest thing from patient-centric innovative medicine. So that's where we're at, kind of depressing, right? Yikes. But it's why all of you are here, and it's why this conversation that you have is so important. But when you layer all that together, you have 40 years of what I would describe as geologic sediment, 40 years of people doing things and getting more money to do things in Washington. And you have people questioning whether business is good or not. And you have incredible complexity. And you have small businesses under enormous pressure, and so they are failing faster or not forming at all. What's the result of that? Our economy is underperforming. We're not creating enough jobs. The debate we're now having is not about creating more jobs, it's about income inequality. We now have resentments about success instead of celebrations of success. And yes, there are spectacular successes sometimes, like Facebook, but there are far too many quiet failures. We have the lowest labor participation rate in 40 years. We have record numbers of unemployed and record numbers of underemployed. And then you see situations, don't get me started on California water again, but truly, if you think about this is to me the classic example of the frog boiling alive and not knowing it. So think about what's going on in California today, because it's an example, I think, of all this. You have media coverage of a drought. Yep, it is a terrible drought. You have media coverage of parched fields. You have the President of the United States flying to California and handing out $160 million to provide relief. California's water crisis is entirely man-made. It is entirely based on bad policy choices over 40 years. California has always had cycles of rainfall and drought, but when politics interferes and you cannot build a single new reservoir in 40 years, despite the doubling of the population in that time, when you cannot build a single water conveyance system for 40 years, because politics and policy intervenes. And when you continue to insist on allowing Washington to literally ration water for farmers in California, you are going to have a disaster. And while people think Silicon Valley is doing great, it is. Los Angeles is doing great. I have been in communities like Central Valley and Fresno where the unemployment rates are in the 20s, and industry after industry, farmer after farmer is being destroyed, and every job along with them. All, not because it's not raining, because of policies that are short-sighted. 70% of the rain that falls every year in California has washed out to sea for 40 years. So what are we to do? It is easy to get really depressed after all of that, and I actually am an optimist. I'm an optimist because I believe we always have everything we need to solve every problem. The only limitless resource in this world is human potential. And human potential, if given the opportunity, always rises to the occasion. Innovation is the application of human potential to a problem. And we need more of that now, not less. I am optimistic at this time because I think this is a time when more things are more possible for more people in more places than ever before. Yes, we got a lot of problems, but you are coming of age at a time in history that is truly revolutionary and transformational. Have you been watching the headlines out of Ukraine? Isn't it amazing we even know what's going on? In the last 15 years, for the first time in human history, Any person, anywhere, can get any piece of information, can communicate with anyone else at any time on any device of their choosing. That is revolutionary. And so all of a sudden, what does that capability do? It unlocks human potential. All of a sudden, technology is a great leveler. It's a great enabler. So if innovation is the application of human potential to a problem, if we need more innovation, not less, to solve these problems, this is the age, this is the time where more things should be more possible for more people. Of course, innovation is risky. Innovation challenges the status quo. And there is never, there's always so much power in the status quo. That's why I asked the question of the swoop, you know, where's the resistance going to come from? I know, I have the scars to prove it. The status quo is unbelievably powerful because people who have succeeded in the status quo want to keep what they have. They're not bad, it's just human nature. I have mine, I want to keep it. And so, a lot of times, innovation is discouraged. And of course, a source of innovation, small business, a source of answers to our problems. Big business may not be politically acceptable quite as much anymore, but small business, the entrepreneur, still is celebrated. Unfortunately, small business doesn't have much political clout. I spend a lot of time talking with innovators and entrepreneurs and small business owners, encouraging them to become more politically active. They don't have to run for office, but they can stay engaged in the political dialogue. And I'll never forget one small business owner looked up to me and said, you know, Carly, honestly, I'm too busy running my business. And of course, that's true. It's hard to find the time, particularly when people aren't so willing to listen to you. Now, all of these things together, it's why I'm a conservative. This is why I'm a conservative. Because I think that to grow our economy, we have to begin to radically transform our institutions. We have to dismantle the regulatory apparatus that has grown up in this country over the last 40 years. We have to literally smash the tax code. 26,000 pages is absurd. We need to make it simpler, and it will be fairer if it is simpler. We need to decentralize decision-making as much as possible. Washington cannot make water rationing decisions for California, and there are a million examples like that. Those are conservative ideals. But I also want to bring it back to something more personal to you and more human to all of us. I said that the one limitless resource we have is human potential, and I believe that. In fact, it's more than a belief. I've seen it demonstrated over and over and over. I have been at the very bottom of business and the very top. I've worked all over the world. I've seen politics. I've seen not-for-profits. I've seen academia. I've seen business. In other words, I've seen a lot of stuff. And I've seen a lot of kinds of people. And this, I will guarantee you, every person has more potential than they realize. Most people never utilize their potential. And so here we have this great untapped resource. But I also know that when people are focused on a worthy goal, when they are bound together to collaborate around a common purpose, when they start to spiral up and think innovatively about how could we do things differently, they can solve problems. But here's the thing, it doesn't just happen. If it just happened, if people just spontaneously gathered together and said, let me be innovative and solve a problem, we'd be in a different spot. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen naturally. Leadership makes it happen. Human potential is unlocked by leadership. And so I have to pause here now and define what I mean by leadership, because all of you, no doubt, will be successful in your lives. But not all of you may choose to lead. So what is leadership? First of all, it's not management. Management's very important. But management is the production of acceptable results within known constraints and conditions. It's important to manage. Leaders do not produce acceptable results within known constraints and conditions. Leaders change the order of things. Leaders change constraints and conditions. Leadership's not about who's in the corner office. I used to think it was. When I was a secretary, I thought the guy who owned the company and sat in the corner office was the leader. He was the leader, but not because he had the office. It's not about the perks. It's not about the power. It's not about the budget. It's not about how many people work for you. Leaders make a positive difference. Leaders change the order of things. Leaders see possibilities, and they seize those possibilities by gathering human potential around them and unlocking it. That's how problems get solved. That's how opportunities get met. Human potential is applied to them, and leadership unlocks that human potential. Sometimes people say to me, well, how do you lead? How do you lead? What's leadership? If it's not measured by, okay, I got the corner office now, I got a big paycheck, I got a lot of people reporting to me, I'm managing my results, well, I'm leading, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. But what is leadership? Leaders start with see possibilities. Leaders, I don't care if you're trying to create a new business, and by the way, every entrepreneur is a leader by definition. Every innovator is a leader. By definition, they see possibilities, and they gather with others to seize those possibilities. And one of the reasons we are the greatest nation on earth is because we gathered people together who wanted to be leaders, because they wanted to be entrepreneurial, because they wanted to build a better life for themselves and their families, and then we let them lead, wherever that took them. When leaders gather, so leaders see something out there. Wherever you're standing right now, the current state, leaders are unsatisfied with that. No, that's better. That's better. It's better if my children are cured. It's better if business rediscovers its moral foundation. It's better if juries can come together seamlessly and efficiently. It's better if Californians have enough water to drink. They see something out there. But how do you gather human potential together to make that possibility a reality? And I don't care whether you're talking about leading 2 people, leading 200,000 people, it's always the same process. And it involves a couple things that I think you don't necessarily learn in business school. But it's what our founding fathers had, it's what Adam Smith had, it's what every leader you know has. First, it's particularly hard in this day and age. You must create the time and space to think. That's what you're doing this weekend. Why is that so important? Think about what technology has done. I talked about how wonderful technology is, and it is. It empowers people, it enables people, it connects people. But what else does technology do? It inundates us with stuff. I mean, we're inundated every minute of every day, 24/7 by stuff. Data, information, requests. And what happens is people get overwhelmed by all that, and they spend way too much time responding to it all. There is a reason, in my opinion, that business has become shorter and shorter and shorter term in its focus. It's why all of us have, if we don't do something about it, because we're reacting to all this stuff. How many of you feel compelled to respond instantly to 80 or 90% of the messages that come your way? I mean, it's a habit. Oh, I got to respond, I got to respond, why? Why? How many times have we made a mistake because we responded instantly, hit send, and thought, oh, How many people have gotten in trouble that way? And how much of what we get inundated with every day is actually worthless chaff? Probably 80%. So why is this so important? Because the only way to see a possibility, the only way to seize a possibility is to create the time and space to think, to reflect. It is getting harder and harder to do that in this, the 21st century world. Everything is instantaneous. And yet, it is an essential part of the creative function, and it is an absolutely essential part of the leadership function. I remember when I first came to Hewlett-Packard, we were in trouble. I mean, underperforming in every conceivable way. We had 87 different business units. We were growing at something like 2% in the middle of the biggest technology upturn in history. Our profitability was deteriorating. We didn't lead in anything anymore, except printers where our margins had been cut in half. And so I said to the senior team, we're going to go away for 3 days and think. What do you suppose the reaction to that was? We don't have time. We can't do that. We can't do that. We have products to produce. We have results to do. We can't do that. But we had to do it. We had to go away and look again at the circumstances in which we found ourselves. And we had to see together the entire picture of who we really were and what we were really doing in order to imagine a better future. Create the time and space to think. Pause. Second, what do leaders always have to do? They have to collaborate. Entrepreneurs do, innovators do, leaders do. They're all the same words, different words for the same thing. Collaborate. It is not command and control. Leadership is never command and control. Management sometimes is. Leadership never is. Why do you collaborate? Because the truth is, for the complicated problems that we face today, for the amazing opportunities we could take advantage of, there are no simple answers. Nobody is smart enough to figure it all out on their own. I found it so interesting with our pitch competitors how many of those were teams of people, and not at all surprised. And what does real effective collaboration take? A lot of people aren't very good at it. A lot of people think collaboration is, we see this on TV all the time, or we see it in political debates. You know, well, that I say what I think and you say what you think. That's not collaboration. That's maybe debate. Maybe you get somewhere that way, but it's not collaboration. Collaboration requires someone to come to the table, however big that table is, or small. Collaboration requires someone to come to the table informed, prepared, capable, but open-minded. Open-minded about, what am I going to learn? What do they know that I don't know? What might we create together in terms of a better idea, a new way to solve an old problem? Third, you have to ask a lot of questions. A lot of questions. The most effective management reviews that I ever have, in any setting, I have 2 things I always do. The first thing I say if I'm going into a new situation is I'll say, I'd like to understand your work, your business, your whatever it is. And so the first question people ask me is, okay, what would you like to know? Sometimes people even want a format for their presentation. Tell me what tell me the format. And in a lot of businesses, you're given a format. I never do that. I always say, I'd like to know what you'd like to tell me. Sometimes people will come back after a day or two of preparation and say, well, am I on the right track? Tell me, give me some guidance. I'd like to know what you'd like to tell me. Because you find out a lot if you let people in an unconstrained way tell you what they think is important. You learn a lot. And then I ask a lot of questions always. And there are 2 kinds of questions. There's closed questions and open questions. You know the difference? So, you know, a closed question is something like, what's your profit going to be in year 3? It has an answer, okay? An open-ended question might be, why is your profit in year 3 higher than year 2? Or why do we do it this way? Or why don't we do it that way? Or why should people in Washington decide on water rationing in California? It is so often the case. By the way, this is what innovators and entrepreneurs do. What do you think John the Father did? He didn't say it this way, but I will guarantee you, John the Father said, "Why should my children die?" Asking a question, the right question, can make all the difference in the future you envision, in the possibilities you see, and it also can make all the difference in how people think about a problem. MBAs are taught to show what you know. Sometimes it's better not to. Sometimes it's better to ask what you want to know. And finally, and you all know this, but it's worth repeating, finally, aim high. Aim high. And while it sounds so easy to say, it's difficult to do, because when you aim high, you can fall short. There are so many businesses, really well-managed businesses. I've been in a lot of these businesses where routinely, quarter after quarter, year after year, the bar gets set really low. And the bar gets set really low so that people can walk over it and succeed. And yet, I will also guarantee you that if you set the bar high for yourself, for those you lead, for how you'll measure your success, if you set that bar high, you may fall short sometimes, but you will most decidedly perform better than walking over that low bar. And here's another thing that I'll tell you about people. People want to be challenged in this way. People want to have impact. Nobody wants to live a meaningless life. Everybody wants to say, I'm engaged in work that matters. I'm making a difference. Remember the story of the policeman who cleared the barricades for John and his family? Why did he do that? Because he was a man looking for meaning. And that act of clearing the way for that family, you know what? I bet it made him think, this is why I became a policeman. Everybody's like that. People want to rise to the occasion. They want to work on real problems. They want to make a positive difference. And everyone has the potential to do so. But leadership must unlock that potential. It takes a leader to say, let us gather together and see a different possibility. It takes a leader to ask the right question. It takes a leader to create an environment where true collaboration and that spiral up that people get when they're cooking on all cylinders and actually making a positive difference. I said that it's easy sometimes to be pessimistic. I mean, it's easy to look out at our country and say, how are we ever going to reform our institutions? How are we ever going to stop this thicket of entrepreneur-killing, job-killing regulation start to get hacked away at? How are we ever going to capture our opportunities? Isn't the frog just boiling to death? It is easy to be pessimistic, and the reason, again, that I am always optimistic is because I know people. I see people. I recognize leaders everywhere. And so as you continue with your conference here, as you continue on with your careers, I know that you think a lot about being successful. I would urge you to think even more about being leaders, true leaders, not measured by your position or your title or your power. Leaders as measured by your impact, by the positive difference you make, by the meaning that you create for yourself and for others. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Time for a few questions. I don't believe this is a shy group. I just don't. Yes, sir.
Some of these, hang on.
Oh, Mike. And someone's phone is here. Is this your phone? No? Okay. Oh,
Some of the students here, when they rise to leadership positions, will work at companies where folks will come in the door and say, let's go to Washington and persuade the government to take our side in the marketplace. What can you say to them about how they should respond when that happens, and how to trade off the responsibilities they have to shareholders and the larger responsibility to create a society that works in the way you've described?
yeah. Well, I think it's a great question, and I guess what I would advise is advise. I will tell you how I've approached that situation, and I don't always get it right, but I think in the end it is more successful. Of course, businesses have to go protect their interests in Washington. Businesses have to, for their shareholders' sake, they have to go try and take advantage of opportunities to improve their competitive position. And so you can get into these dilemmas where, okay, I can go work the system, or you can take advantage of the opportunity that has been presented by that request and actually go and work with government to try and solve the problem. And of course, you want to solve the problem in a way that advantages you and others like you. You don't want to disadvantage yourself. Let me give you an example what I mean. When I was at Hewlett-Packard, the discussion of internet taxation was raging. And of course, you can imagine where people came out. Technology industry came out, no, no, no internet taxation. The retailers all came out and said, oh my gosh, you know, we're getting disadvantaged terribly. We have to have taxation. And as frequently happens in a political dialogue, people line up on each side of that debate and they talk through their talking points. You say your thing, I say my thing, and actually nothing really changes. Forgive me, but I told you I was a philosophy major. So I tend to think about these things in Hegelian terms. Hegel, what did Hegel say? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. What is the synthesis of opposing points of view? So when I went to Washington as head of Hewlett-Packard, as expert witness, what I said was, we must have a fair taxation system. It's clearly unfair that if you sell things over the internet versus in a brick and mortar, that you're treated commercially differently. Heresy for the technology industry. But then I went on to say, however, it's also clearly true that with a tax code as complicated as ours is, with 50 state tax codes on top of our national tax code, that this level of complexity cannot possibly be applied to the internet or internet sales without completely killing the golden goose. And therefore, if you want to talk about internet taxation, you must first talk about tax simplification. Now, I'm not saying that was a brilliant answer, but what I am saying is that it was undeniably true, everything I had said. And in the end, nobody wanted to take on simplification of the tax code. So guess what? There was no internet taxation that year. ultimately that is the answer. So I guess what I would say is every opportunity that you are given to go engage in the political process, take it. But take advantage of that opportunity by bringing the whole of your perspective and your experience to the table, and take advantage of that opportunity not simply by representing the business you happen to be a part of, but think about the larger context as well. Because if you improve the whole system, your business will be advantaged also.
Just thinking about the advice to take time to think, and then that mixed with your comments about information overload. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on if there's an advantage to being, a disadvantage in being a publicly traded company with this information overload, with that increasing short-term focus. And as we are looking out at opportunities to go choose, make careers, even found and create businesses, do you think that if there is that disadvantage where you have all that information coming in, pressure to focus on the short term, is that something that we can change, or is there an advantage to going in that private space?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and it's obviously on a lot of people's minds. So first, the average holding of stock today, of a publicly traded stock, the average holding time is 6 weeks. Okay? So let's be honest and say that these are not the kinds of owners that we talked about in traditional business school classes, where we said, the highest duty we have is to support, to meet the needs of our owners. It's not. They're important. There are many benefits to being in a public market, obviously. Liquidity and access to capital being the most important. Again, I think this comes down to how leaders think about their role. I reject the notion that a CEO's only job is to protect shareholders. I reject that notion. I think actually a CEO's job is to balance the needs and the requirements of shareholders, customers, employees, and communities. Because every single one of those constituencies has a real impact on the health of the business and vice versa. And to do that, to balance those constituencies, and by the way, they have competing needs. Customers always want everything cheaper. Employees always want more security. Shareholders always want to return faster. Communities want more investment. I mean, it's a real balancing act. To balance those requires a long-term view. When I went to speak to the Compact board, as we neared the end of our negotiation process, and they were going to make a decision, would they be acquired by us or not? And I followed the presentation that was made to them by their investment banker, and their investment banker, said what you would expect them to say. Your stock is going to go up, Hewlett-Packard's will go down, hear all the things. And so I started my presentation to the board by saying your stock will not go up. It will go down. And ours will go down, Hewlett-Packard's will go down by 20%. It was 23 the first day, so I was off by a little. And of course, I didn't imagine a proxy battle. But I said, your stock will not go up. It will go down because the market does not yet understand this deal. They don't understand the consolidation that's necessary in the technology industry. By the way, it's not their job to understand it. It's ours. That's why we're running the business. But if we want to secure a future for these businesses, if we want to lead, and in technology, if you're not leading, you're lagging. If you're not innovating, you're losing. If we want to secure our future, then we have to take a longer view than a quarter or 2 or 3. Now, is that a tough decision? You bet. Was there unbelievable pressure on everybody in those two companies as a result? You bet. But in the end, shareholders were served. And we had enough investors, Marilyn among them, by the way, we had enough investors who saw that long-term future that we won our proxy battle. So all of that is to say, I think short-termism is a big problem. I think businesses need to keep in perspective who their owners really are. If you own me for 6 weeks, sorry, I don't have to listen to everything that you say. If you're a long-term holder, that's a whole different problem. And I think it's a leader's job to stay focused on the long term and to do the things that are necessary to create long-term sustainable shareholder value. I apologize, I am getting the hook and I have a train to catch. Thank you so much for including me in this program. Thank you for investing your time in being Adam Smith members. Thank you for engaging in this debate and this dialogue. It truly is important. This is a unique nation on the face of the earth and in human history. That has been true. It is still true. And we are that way because of the magical combination of a radical political idea and the entrepreneurial spirit. All of us have an opportunity and an obligation to keep it alive because that's how we lift people up. Thank you so very much. Enjoy the rest of your conference.